The grammar of PowerPoint. In this video, we're going to cover how you can use animations in PowerPoint to facilitate grammatical meaning, show logical relationships, and reinforce the messaging in your PowerPoint slides. First, we want to understand the purpose of animations. They can enhance visual engagement. Upwards to 70% of people are visual learners, and when you can enhance visual engagement, it helps to reinforce your messaging. In addition, it helps to focus the audience's attention. As you can see with these two animations, I didn't give you my second point until I was ready to tell you about it. That way the audience focuses on the text that you're bringing up. Now that said, you want to be cautious. Animations can distract audiences, undermining your message instead of enhancing it. You don't want these to be too busy. You want your animations to be purposeful so that they reinforce your messaging instead of undermining it. Now, to that end, it's important to understand how animations work. And this is a little bit complicated. So what we're going to do first is cover the functions and then the applications of animations. To access animations, you're going to select the Animations tab, which is located in your top ribbon between the word Transitions and Slideshow. Once you click on that, you'll see a host of options appear. And on the right of those options, there's little up and down arrows. If you select those arrows, it'll actually take you to even more options. Now, in addition, there are two key functions that you want to be aware of. The first is the animation pane. The animation pane allows you to organize and sequence all of your animations, and that's located in the top right of that animations tab. There's also add animation. This is an important function, and that add animation is located to the left of the animation pane on the far right of that tab. Let's take a look at how these animations actually function. First, we have appear, which just snaps the shape or image into place. It's a little abrupt, so I typically avoid that. Fade in works a little bit better in that regard, especially when you're fading in from one text and fading into another. You can use the fade in, fade out to transition smoothly. If you want to create some motion and fly a piece of information or a shape out while flying another piece in, the fly in option works great too. Float in is similar, but it's a little bit softer, and there's some busier ones that I typically avoid, though I do sometimes use others, such as split, wipe, shape, wheel, random bars, grow and turn, zoom, which is good for emphatically drawing in a key point at the end of a slide, swivel, and finally bounce. You can see these last couple take a little bit of time, so keep in mind if these animations take a lot of time or they're very busy, it could distract your message. Now, in addition, there's another option called effects options, and this is located to the very right of all the animations. When you select the effects options, there's a drop-down menu, and it'll actually allow you to change the direction of the animations. So for example, for the fly-in, you might not want it to necessarily fly up, maybe you want it to fly down, or in from the left, in from the right, and even different diagonal options. Now, other animations have similar functions, but not all the same options. We could, for example, split in or split out, split up and down, split from the middle out. Same with the wipe. So check out all these different options and see which ones work best for you. Sometimes when we've used animations to bring a shape forward, we want to add emphasis to those shapes afterwards. To that end, PowerPoint has the emphasis animations. Now keep in mind, if you've already put an animation onto a shape and you want to add emphasis, you need to use the add animation function. Now that's located to the immediate left of the animation pane, which is on the far right of the animations ribbon. Now what happens if you don't use the add animation? You simply write over the existing animation, you replace it. So the emphasis will be the only animation on there. So that's why we need to add the animation. Now, how does that function? Well, let's take a look at that pulse animation. That's a good one. And it just kind of makes that shape pulse. That's good. Maybe it's a little too subtle for you. So you might instead use the color pulse, which is a lot more colorful. Maybe that's too colorful, too dramatic for you, no problem. You could try the teeter option, which just shakes the shape a little bit. And if you want something a little more dramatic than that, you could use the spin option. We also have the grow and shrink option, which will bring the shape forward or pull it to the back, depending on how you animate it. And some of these other emphasis animations are a bit too busy for me. I generally avoid them, but one that I like a lot is the transparency function. And let me show you how that works. Maybe you bring up an idea and you want to keep that idea on the screen, but you don't want your reader to focus on that. So as you bring up your second idea, you make that transparent so the reader doesn't focus on that, but rather the second idea. And as you bring up your third idea, you do the same thing. And as a result, your reader will now be focused on whatever idea you've brought forward rather than the idea that you had already talked about. You may have noticed that some of the emphasis animations have letters inside them. These are specifically for text. For example, we have the brush color, which will brush a color across the text and change the color. Inversely, we have the font color, which will simply fade in a different color. And then we also have the option for underline text. In addition, we have the bold flash, which will quickly bring the text into bold and return it to the original format. And if we want to hold on to that bold for a little longer, we have the bold reveal. In addition, we have the wave, which is a little fancier, it's a little busier, and it might be distracting in most contexts. However, you might find this or other animations useful, so explore them and see what works best within the context of your own presentation. As you go through the animation options, you'll find something called the motion paths. These can be really handy if you want to move something around on the screen. First, we have the straight line, which obviously will move a shape or image in a straight line, followed by the arc, which will move it in a semicircle. We also have the turns, which will move the image or shape in a right angle, and the circle, if we just want to bring it around full stop, as well as a figure 8 loop. Now the last one here is the customized path, and this one's a little tricky. You need a steady hand to move that around. As you can see, I do not have a steady hand. Now keep in mind that for each of these, save the customized path, there's a default landing spot as soon as you select that space. But you might want to move it to a spot other than that. In this case, what you're going to do to customize the destination is simply click on the red dot and then drag it to your desired location. Now, just as we can use animations to bring an image or shape onto your screen, you can also use animations to take them off. This is particularly handy if you want to make room for a new idea, and all of the different options like bounce in, bounce out that you have to bring something in, you can also use those same animations in reverse to bring them out. And you'll see that they all have a different amount of time, so be careful to use ones that work with your timing. And again, you can use the effects options to change the direction so that a bounce can bounce to the left or bounce to the right. A fly out can fly through the top, through the bottom, or to the left or to the right. When you have a series of animations on a single slide, you're going to have to organize them. To that end, you need the animation pane. Again, this function is located in the top right corner of the animation ribbon. And when you click on it, you're going to get this sidebar that shows you all the different animations that you've put on your slide. If you want to change when or how a specific animation starts, what you're going to do is click on it, at which time there'll be an arrow that appears on the right side. Once you click on that arrow, you're going to get a drop-down menu that looks a lot like this. Let's take a look at each of our options. The first one being Start on Click. Now right now you'll see that there's a highlight over the words Start on Click, but there's no text box beside it. I'm now going to hit the click button and the text will come out. This is actually the default, so every time you create an animation, it'll automatically be set to Start on Click. And it's not going to appear on the screen until you hit the click button. Now we also have one called Start with Previous. Now in this context, as the highlight appeared, the text beside it appeared at the same time because I selected Start with Previous, and that means the animation will start at the same time that the animation before it begins. The third option is Start After Previous. Now this time, when the highlight came over Start After Previous, the text didn't come in until afterwards, and that's because I set that text to Start After Previous. And this means that the animation will begin after the previous animation is completed. Now below that we have several other options, including timing. But timing is a little more complicated. So let's go into a little more detail and take a look at that. One of the most useful features in the timing option is the delay option. And this allows you to delay when an animation starts. Now, you already have the after previous option, so why do you need a delay option? Well, there's a big difference between starting two animations with each other by adding a slight delay to the second one and waiting until the first animation finishes. Let's first start by starting with. These boxes start with each other. The reader gets all the text at the same time. But you might want to recreate the reading process by adding a delay. So you say, hey, I'll start after. So it looks like this. These boxes start after each other. But you can see when we wait for one animation to finish before the next one begins that it adds time. So what we're going to do now, these boxes are delayed and start with each other. Now these were all set up to start with each other, but we added a half-second delay to each one. And that made it a little smoother. Now this might be a little bit too busy, but you get the idea. This is just an example. Use your imagination, get creative, and find something that works for you. Even more important than the delay option is the duration option, which you can see here. Is your animation too fast or too slow? Don't worry, you can customize the speed. For example, here we have 1/4 of a second, half a second, 3/4 of a second, 1 second, 1.5 seconds, finally 2 full seconds. As you see as we go through here, the very first one, a little too quick, that last one, much too slow. Keep in mind that you want to find a time that works well with the flow of your presentation and within the context of your slide. You also want to consider the distance that the shape or image is traveling. If you have a shape or image going all the way across the screen, you might need the 2 full seconds. But if it's only going 1/3 or 1/4 of the way across the screen, you might stick with half a second. Choose a time that doesn't draw attention to itself. These animations should facilitate and reinforce your messaging, not distract the reader. Be careful, experiment, but choose what works best for you. All right, let's take a quick summary of the functionality of the animations we just covered. First is the animations themselves. We have the entrances, we have the emphasis, we have the motions, and we have the exits. Choose the ones that make the most sense for you, that reinforce your meaning, and make sure they don't draw attention to themselves. The next is the start time. We can choose when they start. Start on a click, start with the previous animation, or start after a previous animation. And finally, we have timing, where we can consider both whether or not we want to delay an animation or whether we want to lengthen or shorten the duration of an animation. Now that we know how the animations function, let's understand how we can use animation to facilitate grammatical meaning within the context of our PowerPoint slides. With that in mind, we're going to consider both shapes and text. Shapes are a central component of almost all PowerPoint slides. Therefore, we want to understand the strategies we can use to animate shapes that will allow us to convey the grammatical and logical relationships we're trying to express in our slides. Let's first talk about the ways in which we can use shapes and animations to introduce lists and describe processes. We begin with the fly-in. We can also use the float-in, and we can also use the wipe. Let's start with that fly-in first. Here, you see those images coming up. We can start on click, start with previous, start after previous, whatever works for you. I go with start on click, so I bring up one item, talk about it, bring in the other. That way the audience focuses on what I'm talking about. Regardless, you want to consider timing. That means the shapes that have to cross the entire slide should have a long duration. Shapes that cover a short space, short duration. If you give them the same amount of time, one of them will zip across the screen, the other one's going to crawl to its spot. The audience will notice that inconsistency, it will be distracting. Now, the other thing you want to consider is location. If that first ID is up top, have those shapes fly up, right? That way they build on each other and they don't cross over each other. If it's on the bottom, have them fly down. Now, if you're coming in from the side, oftentimes they'll be covering the same distance, so the timing will be the same, no problem. But consider this, if the shapes are flying in from the side or even from the top or bottom, have them enter the slide from the empty space. We don't want them crossing over other shapes. Their colors may clash and it might be distracting for the audience. Now, we also have the float in. Items 1, 2, 3. You see each of them are coming in from about an inch below where they land, so they all have the same distance to cover. Therefore, they'll have the same timing. Again, if that first point is up top, have it float up. If it's on the bottom, have it float down. That way the animation doesn't cross over other slides. And again, we get that directional relationship. We also have the wipe, and the wipe is especially good for processes, right? We start with step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now in this context, again, if that first point is at the top, you wipe down to create that directional relationship between the items, especially for a process. If it's at the bottom, wipe up. Now, finally, we can also wipe from side to side. In this context, we want to consider, if you are going to wipe across, go in the direction your audience reads. For example, in English, people read from left to right. So we're going to swipe from left to right. Fly, float, and wipe in the appropriate direction when using directional shapes. Here we have the arrow. We fly in from the left toward the right because that's the direction that the arrow is pointing in. Now, I recommended fly, float, and wipe, but you know what? You can mix it up from time to time and use the fades. Those are a really effective strategy. Let's fade out here, and we fade in with step 1, step 2, and step 3. So the fade can also be a really effective strategy. What about contrasting shapes? Well, as we've talked about in the shapes video, when we have contrasting ideas, the thesis, the antithesis, we put them on opposite sides. We want to use the animations in that same way. We animate them so that the opposing ideas enter from opposite sides. This works for fly-ins, float-ins, and wipes. Emphasis. Whenever we want to bring in information that adds emphasis, we might consider the zoom in and even add a pulse after, and maybe the little teeter if you want. I usually avoid the teeter. I find it to be a little bit busy. Now this zoom and pulse, it can be a little distracting. I use it sparingly only when I have an emphatic point I really want to bring in or an exclamation that I want to add to a key idea. Now that we have a clear understanding of how we can animate our shapes, let's focus on the strategies we can use when we want to animate the text in our PowerPoint slides. For text animations, I typically use one of 4 options: fade, wipe, zoom, and pulse. When to use each? I typically use fades when I have a short clause that extends beyond a single line, right? That's important. But if each clause is a single line, then I use the wipe. In this context, it mimics the reading process so the audience can kind of follow the text as it's coming along. Now, the zoom and pulse is what I use when I have one of those emphatic notes that I'm adding at the end of a slide. Again, I use these sparingly. They're used for emphasis. I'll zoom it in and maybe pulse the text afterwards. I'll also sometimes add a pulse to a text that I'm trying to draw attention to, maybe a particular word or something in a quote. Now that we have the basic functions, let's practice. Here, we're introducing a biography of Nicolas Cage. Each item is on one line, so we wipe across. Birthday, January 7th, 1964. Full name, Nicholas Kim Coppola. Family members, and then we bring in each family member. 1, 2, 3. Now in that context, because each of these lines just take up a single line, we can use that wipe across, and the reader or audience members will read along with that, and it'll reinforce and mimic that reading process, encouraging them to follow along as you're talking. Special note, if all the text appears at once, your audience may read ahead as you speak. This means that you'll be competing for their attention with your own text. Now, if you'll notice here, this first sentence I brought in by itself. Then, after I was done reading it, I brought in the second sentence. As a result, you would have ideally been focused on what I was saying instead of reading ahead. Let's talk about the awards Nicolas Cage has won. He has an Academy Award. Now you'll notice I use the fade in here, even though it's a single line. And that's because I want each of my bullets to be consistent with respect to how they're brought onto the screen. The next item, the Screen Actors Guild Award. This takes up 2 lines, so I use the fade instead of the wipe. And this is why I use the fade for the Academy Award, so that they're consistent. If I had introduced the Screen Actors Guild with a wipe, you'll see that the words Screen and Award appear at the same time, and then Actors Guild comes after. And it kind of makes it awkward for the audience to read. So that's why we use the fade in. And then finally, we bring in the third one, a Golden Globe Award, also a fade in, because we want all 3 bullets to be brought in a consistent fashion so as not to distract the audience. Let's list Nicolas Cage's films. We have Con Air, and here we bring in the wipe across, and then afterwards we bring the pulse in. Face Off, another pulse. National Treasure, City of Angels, The Rock, and finally Gone in 60 Seconds. Now this is one option that you can use. A lot of people don't like to have the empty space up there the entire time. So rather than bringing the images in, they might have them in to start and then add the pulse afterwards as they're bringing up the films. But here we've used the text and the pulse to connect the text with the corresponding image. And that forms a relationship and uses those visual images to reinforce what you're trying to convey. Now, alternately, we can start with a blank canvas. We bring in our first film, Wild at Heart, fly in from the top. Adaption, fly in from the top again. Pig, flying from the bottom. Vampire's Kiss, flying from the bottom. Now, these are slightly different animations, but they're mirrored, so the reader still gets the sense that these films are on parody terms. However, sometimes we want to give preference or priority. And that grammatical relationship, that logical relationship can be conveyed by using different animations. So now we're going to bring in our final film, Leaving Las Vegas. And after that comes up, we drop in our Oscar in the bottom right corner. Now, as Leaving Las Vegas zoomed in, which was a different animation than all the other ones, so we give that one priority. We've also centered it on the page, so the location is important. The other 4 had the transparency animation applied so that they're all faded in the background. And this allows you to encourage your reader and your audience to prioritize certain ideas above others. Now keep in mind, when you're pairing text with images, bring the image after your text. The problem there, if you bring them in at the same time, the text will be competing with the image. You want that text first, and then the image comes in after to reinforce it. When they come in at the same time, your audience will be focused on that image, and they're not even going to notice that text coming in. Now, let's do a quick summary of how we're going to handle those animations for the shape and text, beginning with the shapes. Our first option, fly in. This one works really good. The float in's a little more subtle. You can also use that. And I also like the wipe a lot. I think that works great. Now, from time to time, we're going to use the zoom and the fade when appropriate. I actually might use the fades a little more often than float in, but the key ones there are the fly and the wipe. Now, with respect to the text, we want to use a heavy dose of wipe and fade. Those are the 2 most effective. Fade the text in or wipe it across if it's a single line. You'll occasionally use zoom or pulse for emphasis, but don't use them too often. Use them sparingly. Don't let them be a distraction. And finally, we do want to consider timing, especially for the wipe. If you have a short line, use a short amount of time to wipe across. If it's a longer line, use a longer time or a longer duration for the animation to wipe across that long line. Otherwise, it's going to appear too quick. As we wrap up, let's take a look at a couple of important notes. First, animations are meant to enhance and reinforce your text. You want them to reinforce what you're saying. Do not turn them into a distraction. You don't want to use them haphazardly and use them excessively just for the sake of using animations, because it will be distracting. Keep in mind too, the context. In-person presentations will use fewer animations as body language can be used in their place. We don't need to highlight and underline and pulse a word that we want the reader to focus on because we can simply point to it. But when you have online presentations, you're often going to use animations more because the body language is absent. You can't point to a word you want the reader to focus on, so you might highlight the word instead. That's all we have for this episode of the Grammar of PowerPoint. However, if you want to learn how you can effectively convey grammar and logical relationships in PowerPoint by using other features such as transitions, images, and shapes, be sure to check out our other videos. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.